In the exclusive gated community of Maplewood Heights, where million-dollar mansions stood like monuments to success and children rode to private schools in chauffeur-driven cars, 12-year-old Lawrence Smith had learned that sometimes the cruelest prisons were built not of bars and concrete, but of damaged spinal cords and the word permanent. For 18 months, the boy who had once been the fastest runner in his grade, the kid who could climb any tree and leap any fence, had been confined to a wheelchair, the victim of a diving accident that severed his connection to everything below his waist. But what made Lawrence's story truly impossible wasn't just his paralysis. It was the fact that a single father named Mark Lopez, a former Navy medic turned handyman who lived in the modest apartments across town, would somehow help him walk again. And when Lawrence's billionaire pharmaceutical heiress mother learned what this working-class man had accomplished without her money, her technology, or her army of specialists, her response would shake the foundations of everything both families believed about healing, hope, and the true meaning of wealth. Before we dive into this incredible journey, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from around the world. And if stories of impossible comebacks inspire you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have something even more extraordinary to share with you. The morning fog rolled across the manicured lawns of Maplewood Heights like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of gardeners tending to rose bushes and pool maintenance crews preparing backyard oases for another day in paradise. In the sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion at 47 Willowbrook Drive, Lawrence Smith sat in his custom wheelchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows of what had once been called the family room, but now felt more like a medical facility disguised as luxury living space. At 12 years old, Lawrence possessed the kind of striking intelligence that had once made teachers predict great things for his future. Dark eyes that missed nothing, a quick wit that could solve complex puzzles faster than most adults, and a smile that had once lit up every room he entered. Now that smile appeared rarely, replaced by the careful politeness of a child who had learned to manage adults' discomfort with his condition. The accident had happened at the Riverside Country Club's Olympic-sized pool during what should have been a perfect summer afternoon. Lawrence had been showing off for his friends, attempting a dive from the highest board that he'd practiced dozens of times before. But this time, something went wrong. A miscalculation, a moment of overthinking, a fraction of an inch that separated a perfect dive from a life-altering collision with the pool's bottom. The medical reports filled 3 thick binders that sat locked in his mother's home office like evidence in a case that would never go to trial. Complete spinal cord injury at the T12 level. Permanent paralysis of both lower extremities. No sensation or voluntary movement below the point of injury. Each specialist who reviewed Lawrence's case, and there had been 17 of them, from Johns Hopkins to the Mayo Clinic to experimental research facilities in Switzerland, delivered the same devastating conclusion with varying degrees of professional sympathy. The damage is complete and irreversible, Dr. Patricia Henley from the Neurological Institute had explained to Lawrence's mother, Victoria Ashford Smith, during their consultation 6 months after the accident. The spinal cord doesn't regenerate the way other tissues do. While we can work on maximizing his upper body strength and helping him adapt to life in a wheelchair, any hope of regaining function in his legs would require technology that simply doesn't exist yet. Victoria had nodded with the composed dignity of a woman who had built a pharmaceutical empire by refusing to accept limitations, but privately she had increased her company's funding for spinal cord research by $20 million. If medical technology didn't exist to heal her son, she would create it. If the world's best specialists couldn't offer hope, she would hire better specialists. The Ashford-Smith family fortune, built over 3 generations in the pharmaceutical industry, had always been Victoria's weapon against problems that money could solve. When Lawrence needed the best wheelchair, she commissioned a custom design from European engineers. When he required physical therapy, she converted the mansion's guest wing into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center. When the local schools couldn't accommodate his needs, she hired a team of private tutors with advanced degrees in special education. But 18 months of unlimited resources had produced the same result as 18 months of conventional care. Lawrence remained paralyzed, and every expert consultation reinforced the medical consensus that his condition was permanent. The boy who had once filled the mansion with the sounds of laughter, running footsteps, and endless questions about how everything worked now spent his days in careful quiet, navigating between the physical therapy sessions that maintained his upper body strength and the tutoring sessions that kept his brilliant mind occupied. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of wheelchair accessibility, ramps instead of stairs, elevators instead of spontaneous climbing, careful planning instead of impulsive adventure. Lawrence's father had been absent from his life since before the accident, a venture capitalist who had decided that fatherhood didn't align with his lifestyle goals. The divorce had been swift and expensive, leaving Victoria with full custody and Lawrence with the understanding that some people could be bought out of caring. It was a lesson that had made him wary of trusting adults who promised more than they could deliver. The medical equipment that filled corners of their home told the story of their journey through the maze of specialists and experimental treatments. Standing frames designed to prevent bone loss, electrical stimulation devices meant to maintain muscle tone, computer interfaces that allowed Lawrence to control various aspects of his environment through eye movements or head gestures. Each piece of technology represented another attempt to solve a problem that seemed immune to technological solutions. Victoria's assistant, Rebecca Chen, managed Lawrence's care schedule with the efficiency of a military operation. Physical therapy at 9, occupational therapy at 11, academic tutoring from 2 to 4, and medical consultations that rotated through specialists who had exhausted their conventional options but continued accepting consultation fees to maintain hope. The mansion's staff had adapted to Lawrence's needs with professional discretion. The housekeepers ensured that all pathways remained clear for wheelchair navigation. The cook prepared meals that could be easily managed from a seated position. The groundskeeping crew maintained the garden paths at perfect smoothness to prevent wheelchair troubles. Everyone treated Lawrence's paralysis as a logistical challenge to be managed rather than a tragedy to be mourned, which was exactly how Victoria preferred it. But despite the millions spent on medical care, despite the conversion of their home into a rehabilitation facility, despite the army of specialists who continued to monitor Lawrence's condition, the boy who had once been the fastest runner in his grade remained trapped in a wheelchair that had become both his mobility and his prison. The stack of medical files in Victoria's office grew thicker each month, each consultation adding another layer of professional certainty that Lawrence's paralysis was permanent and irreversible. The world's most advanced medical technology, unlimited financial resources, and the expertise of internationally renowned specialists had all reached the same conclusion. Some damage couldn't be undone, some connections couldn't be restored, some miracles were beyond the reach of even unlimited wealth. Lawrence had stopped asking when he might walk again, sometime around his first anniversary in the wheelchair. The question had been replaced by a quiet acceptance that seemed mature beyond his 12 years but broke something fundamental in the hearts of everyone who loved him. He had learned to navigate his new reality with grace and intelligence, but the boy who had once dreamed of becoming a professional athlete now focused his ambitions on futures that could be achieved from a seated position. As the morning fog lifted from Maplewood Heights, revealing another perfect day in paradise, Lawrence sat by his window and watched the neighborhood children walk to the bus stop for another day at the local public school. He no longer wondered what it would feel like to join them. After 18 months of medical certainty, he had learned that wondering about impossible things was a luxury that paralyzed children couldn't afford. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mark Lopez arrived at the Ashford Smith mansion on a Tuesday morning in a 15-year-old pickup truck that looked like it had survived several tours of duty, much like its owner. At 42, Mark carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to fix things that others deemed beyond repair, first as a Navy corpsman in 3 combat deployments, and now as a handyman in the modest neighborhoods where people couldn't afford to replace what could be restored. Victoria had called Lopez & Sons Home Repair the previous evening after her regular contractor had quoted her $18,000 to install a motorized wheelchair lift on the mansion's grand staircase. The astronomical price had offended her business sensibilities more than her billionaire budget, and Rebecca had found Mark's company through an online search for affordable accessibility modifications. "Mrs. Ashford Smith?" Mark called as he approached the mansion's imposing front entrance, his worn work boots quiet on the marble steps. He carried a simple toolbox that looked decades old, but meticulously maintained, each tool in its designated place, with the precision of someone who had learned that organization could mean the difference between life and death. Victoria emerged from the house wearing the kind of effortless elegance that cost thousands of dollars to achieve, silk blouse, tailored slacks, jewelry that caught the morning light like captured stars. At 38, she possessed the commanding presence of someone accustomed to boardrooms, where her decisions affected thousands of employees and millions in quarterly earnings. "Mr. Lopez," she said, extending a manicured hand with the polite efficiency of someone who had learned to manage contractors through brief, professional interactions. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I understand you specialize in accessibility modifications." Mark accepted her handshake with calloused fingers that spoke of decades working with tools and healing hands in equal measure. "Yes, ma'am. I've done quite a bit of work, helping folks adapt their homes after injuries or disabilities. May I ask what specific modifications you're looking for?" Victoria gestured toward the grand staircase that dominated the mansion's foyer like a monument to architectural ambition. "My son uses a wheelchair, and we need a lift system that will allow him to access the second floor independently. My regular contractor quoted me $18,000 for installation." Mark studied the staircase with the analytical eye of someone who had learned to see solutions where others saw only problems. The curved design would indeed present challenges for a standard lift system, but nothing that required the premium pricing that wealthy clients often attracted. "Mind if I take some measurements and see the space?" he asked, already calculating materials and labor in his head. "I might be able to offer you some alternatives that would be more cost-effective." As Mark examined the staircase, Victoria found herself studying this unexpected contractor. Unlike the polished professionals she usually dealt with, Mark possessed an authenticity that money couldn't purchase. His questions about the lift requirements focused on functionality rather than aesthetics, and his suggestions prioritized her son's independence over impressive engineering. "You mentioned your son uses a wheelchair," Mark said as he measured angles and clearances. "How old is he?" "Sometimes the approach changes depending on whether we're planning for a growing child or adult needs." "Lawrence is 12, Victoria replied, though something in Mark's tone suggested more than professional curiosity. "He's been paralyzed for 18 months following a diving accident." Mark paused in his measurements, his expression shifting to something that looked like recognition. "Spinal cord injury?" "Complete T12 injury," Victoria confirmed, using the medical terminology that had become second nature after countless specialist consultations. "Every doctor we've consulted says the paralysis is permanent." For a moment, Mark's professional demeanor gave way to something more personal. "I worked with a lot of spinal cord injuries during my time as a Navy corpsman," he said quietly. "Saw some remarkable recoveries that the doctors said weren't possible." Victoria felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Over the past 18 months, she had learned to recognize the tone of well-meaning people who offered hope based on stories they'd heard, rather than medical expertise they possessed. "Mr. Lopez, I appreciate your optimism, but we've consulted with 17 specialists. The damage is complete and irreversible." "I'm sure you have," Mark replied gently. "And I'm not a doctor, but I am someone who's seen the human body accomplish things that medical textbooks say can't happen." "Bays." Before Victoria could respond, Lawrence appeared at the top of the staircase, his wheelchair positioned at the edge of the steps like a bird perched at the edge of a cliff. At 12, he possessed an alertness that came from being the center of adult conversations about his condition. He had learned to read the subtle changes in tone that indicated whether people were discussing his medical reality or indulging in wishful thinking. "Mom, who's the contractor?" Lawrence called down, his voice carrying the polite interest of a child who had grown accustomed to home modifications being discussed around him rather than with him. Mark looked up at the boy, seeing past the wheelchair to the intelligent eyes and restless energy that spoke of a spirit that hadn't been broken by physical limitations. "I'm Mark Lopez," he called back. "I'm here to figure out how to get you upstairs without having to wait for anyone else to help." Something in Mark's direct address, speaking to Lawrence rather than about him, caught the boy's attention. Most adults either avoided eye contact or spoke with the carefully cheerful tone reserved for disabled children. Mark's approach suggested he saw a person rather than a medical condition. "What kind of lift are you thinking about?" Lawrence asked, wheeling closer to the staircase's edge with the casual confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the boundaries between his wheelchair world and the walking world around him. Mark pulled out a tablet and began sketching a simple diagram. "Well, there are a few options. We could install a straight rail system if we modify the staircase angle slightly. Or we could go with a platform lift that follows the curve of your stairs. Both would give you complete independence, but they work differently. As Mark explained the technical aspects of each system, Victoria noticed that he directed his explanations toward Lawrence rather than toward her. Unlike the medical professionals who discussed treatment options with parents while patients listened passively, Mark treated her 12-year-old son as the primary decision-maker about his own mobility. "How long have you been doing accessibility work?" Lawrence asked, clearly engaged in a way that Victoria rarely saw during medical consultations. "About 8 years," Mark replied. "Started after I got out of the Navy. I'd worked with a lot of injured service members and realized that adapting to disability was often more about creative problem-solving than expensive technology." Victoria found herself studying this unexpected contractor with growing curiosity. His approach to Lawrence's accessibility needs felt fundamentally different from the medical establishment's focus on managing limitations. Mark seemed focused on eliminating barriers rather than adapting to them. "During your military service," Victoria asked carefully, "did you work specifically with paralyzed patients?" Mark's expression grew thoughtful. "Among others, yes. Combat injuries, training accidents, medical conditions that developed during deployment. I learned that the human body has remarkable capacity for adaptation and recovery, especially when conventional wisdom gets out of the way." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything Victoria had been told over the past 18 months. 17 specialists had used phrases like medical reality and acceptance of limitations, but Mark spoke about adaptation and recovery as if they were interchangeable concepts. "Mr. Lopez," Victoria said slowly, "are you suggesting that my son's paralysis might not be as permanent as we've been told?" Mark met her gaze steadily. "I'm suggesting that I've seen enough unexpected recoveries to believe that permanent is sometimes just another word for we don't know how to help yet." Lawrence had grown very quiet during this exchange, his intelligent eyes moving between his mother and this contractor, who spoke about his condition with a confidence that medical experts had never displayed. For 18 months, every adult conversation about his future had carried undertones of limitation and adaptation. Mark's words suggested possibilities that had been declared impossible. "What kind of recoveries did you see?" Lawrence asked quietly, his voice carrying the careful hope of someone who had learned not to expect miracles but couldn't quite stop wanting them. Mark looked directly at the boy, his expression serious but warm. "I saw people walk again when doctors said they wouldn't. I saw sensation return to limbs that were supposed to be permanently numb. I saw the human nervous system repair itself in ways that medical textbooks claimed were impossible." Victoria felt the familiar stirring of hope that she had learned to suppress, the dangerous emotion that led to disappointment and the crushing weight of reality reasserting itself. But something about Mark's quiet confidence, his direct manner with Lawrence, and his obvious expertise in both medical care and practical problem-solving made her pause before dismissing his words as uninformed optimism. "You're not just talking about wheelchair lifts, are you?" she asked. Mark smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since his arrival. "Mrs. Ashford Smith, I came here to install accessibility equipment. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't thinking about whether that equipment might someday become unnecessary." As Mark gathered his tools and prepared to leave with promises to return the next day with detailed installation plans, Victoria found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about her son's future. For 18 months, unlimited wealth had failed to provide hope. Now a working-class handyman with a battered pickup truck was suggesting that maybe the impossible wasn't as impossible as the experts claimed. Lawrence remained at the top of the staircase long after Mark had driven away, staring down at the steps that had become a barrier between him and half of his own home. For the first time in months, those stairs looked less like an insurmountable obstacle and more like a temporary inconvenience. Something about Mark Lopez had been different from every other adult who had promised to help. He hadn't spoken about managing Lawrence's disability. He had spoken about eliminating it entirely. That evening, Victoria found herself pacing the marble floors of her home office, Mark Lopez's words echoing in her mind like stones thrown into still water. The leather-bound medical files that documented Lawrence's condition sat on her mahogany desk like monuments to professional certainty, each consultation report reinforcing the same devastating conclusion with clinical precision. Dr. Henley's voice played on repeat in her memory. The damage is complete and irreversible. Dr. Martinez from Johns Hopkins had been even more definitive. Any hope of recovery would require regeneration of spinal cord tissue, which is medically impossible with current technology. The Swiss specialist, Dr. Kruger, had charged $50,000 for a consultation that lasted 47 minutes and ended with the same verdict delivered in 3 languages. Victoria had built her pharmaceutical empire on evidence-based science, on peer-reviewed research, on the kind of methodical analysis that separated wishful thinking from medical reality. She had funded laboratories where brilliant minds worked toward breakthroughs in spinal cord research, investing millions in cutting-edge technology that might someday, in 10 years, maybe 20, offer hope to patients like Lawrence. But here was a handyman with a pickup truck suggesting that the impossible might be possible right now, based on anecdotal observations from military service rather than controlled clinical trials. Everything in her scientific training screamed that this was exactly the kind of false hope that devastated families who couldn't accept medical reality. She pulled out her phone and dialed Dr. Henley's private number, a privilege that came with having donated $3 million to the Neurological Institute's research fund. Victoria. Dr. Henley's voice came through with the warm professionalism reserved for major benefactors. How is Lawrence doing? I hope the new physical therapy routine is helping with his upper body strength. Patricia, I need to ask you something directly, Victoria said, settling into the leather chair behind her desk. Is there any possibility, any at all, that Lawrence's paralysis might not be as permanent as we've been told? The pause that followed lasted long enough for Victoria to hear the subtle shift in Dr. Henley's tone from warm to carefully clinical. Victoria, we've discussed this extensively. Lawrence's MRI results show complete disruption of the spinal cord at the T12 level. There's no neural pathway for signals to travel from his brain to his lower extremities. While medical science is advancing rapidly, complete spinal cord regeneration remains beyond our current capabilities. But you've seen unexpected recoveries before, haven't you? Victoria pressed, thinking of Mark's quiet confidence. Cases where patients regained function that medical theory said was impossible? Dr. Henley's response came with the patience of someone accustomed to managing desperate parents. Victoria, what we sometimes see are cases of incomplete injuries that were initially misdiagnosed as complete. We also see patients who learn to compensate so effectively that they appear to have regained function. But Lawrence's case has been thoroughly documented by multiple specialists. The injury is complete, and complete spinal cord injuries do not spontaneously heal. After ending the call, Victoria stared at her reflection in the office's floor-to-ceiling windows. Dr. Henley's explanation made perfect scientific sense, backed by decades of research and thousands of documented cases. Yet something about Mark Lopez's certainty had shaken her faith in the finality of expert opinion. Meanwhile, Lawrence lay in his specially designed bed, staring at the ceiling while his mind wrestled with possibilities he had trained himself not to consider. For 18 months, he had been the perfect patient, cooperative during therapy sessions, positive during family visits, adaptive to each new piece of assistive technology that arrived to make his wheelchair life more manageable. He had learned to read the careful expressions of adults who spoke about his bright future, while their eyes carried the sadness reserved for dreams that would never be fulfilled. Teachers spoke about careers he could pursue from a wheelchair. Therapists focused on maximizing his remaining abilities. Even his mother, for all her wealth and determination, had shifted her conversations from "when you walk again" to "as you continue to adapt." But Mark Lopez had looked him directly in the eye and spoken about walking as if it were a legitimate possibility rather than a cruel fantasy. Lawrence found himself remembering sensations he had trained himself to forget: the feeling of grass beneath bare feet, the rhythm of running, the simple pleasure of standing tall enough to reach high shelves without asking for help. The next morning brought Dr. James Crawford, Lawrence's primary rehabilitation specialist, for their weekly consultation. Dr. Crawford had been working with Lawrence since 2 months after the accident, a gentle man in his 50s whose approach combined realistic goal setting with genuine compassion for his young patient. "Lawrence seems more engaged today," Dr. Crawford observed as he watched the boy work through his range of motion exercises. "Something's changed since our last session." Victoria, who had been watching from her usual spot in the corner of the home therapy room, felt her chest tighten. He met someone yesterday who suggested that his paralysis might not be permanent. Dr. Crawford's hands paused in their work, his expression shifting to the concerned attention that medical professionals reserved for potentially harmful misinformation. What kind of someone? Another specialist? A handyman, Victoria admitted, feeling foolish as she said it. A former Navy corpsman who's done accessibility work. He claims to have seen recoveries that doctors said were impossible. Dr. Crawford resumed Lawrence's exercises, but his movements had acquired the careful precision of someone choosing his words. Victoria, I understand how tempting it can be to grasp at hope when conventional medicine has reached its limits. But it's important to understand that anecdotal stories, especially from non-medical sources, can be deeply misleading. Lawrence had been listening to this conversation with the sharp attention of someone whose future was being discussed as if he weren't present. Dr. Crawford, have you ever seen anyone with my type of injury recover sensation or movement? The doctor's expression softened as he addressed his young patient directly. Lawrence, Indiana, 23 years of practice. I've seen remarkable adaptations and improvements in quality of life. I've seen patients achieve independence that seemed impossible immediately after their injuries. But complete spinal cord injuries like yours don't heal spontaneously. But what if they're not as complete as you think? Lawrence pressed, his voice carrying a determination that Victoria hadn't heard in months. What if there are pathways that the tests can't detect? Dr. Crawford exchanged a glance with Victoria before responding. Lawrence, the diagnostic technology we use can detect neural pathways with extraordinary precision. Your MRI results, your nerve conduction studies, your clinical examinations, they all confirm that the connection between your brain and your legs has been severed. After Dr. Crawford left, Victoria found Lawrence in his room, staring out the window at the neighborhood children playing soccer in the park across the street. His expression carried the weight of someone processing the collision between hope and medical reality. Mom, Lawrence said without turning from the window, what if Dr. Crawford is wrong? What if all the doctors are wrong? Victoria felt her heart breaking and mending simultaneously. For 18 months, she had worked to help Lawrence accept his limitations, to find peace with his new reality, to build a meaningful life within the boundaries that his injury had imposed. Now she was watching him rediscover hope that might lead to crushing disappointment. Sweetheart, she said carefully, settling into the chair beside his wheelchair, the doctors who've examined you are among the best in the world. They've studied thousands of cases like yours. They're not wrong out of ignorance or lack of caring. But they might be wrong about what's possible, Lawrence replied, finally turning to face her. Mr. Lopez didn't sound like someone who was guessing. He sounded like someone who knew something they don't. That afternoon, Victoria made a decision that went against every instinct her scientific training had developed. She called Mark Lopez and asked him to return, not to discuss wheelchair lifts, but to explain exactly what he had seen during his military service that gave him such confidence in the possibility of recovery. When Rebecca asked if she should schedule the appointment for later in the week, Victoria surprised herself by saying, quote, "Ask him to come tonight, after Lawrence's therapy sessions are finished." As evening approached, Victoria found herself consumed by doubts that felt both rational and cowardly. Mark Lopez was not a neurologist, not a researcher, not someone whose opinion carried the weight of medical degrees and published studies. He was a handyman who fixed broken things for people who couldn't afford to replace them. But Lawrence had spent the entire day with an energy and engagement that had been absent for months. During his afternoon tutoring session, he had asked questions about the mechanics of nerve regeneration. During dinner, he had talked about activities he might want to try someday rather than activities he could do from his wheelchair. Victoria had spent 18 months watching her son adapt to limitations with grace and maturity that broke her heart. Now she was watching him rediscover the possibility of breaking free from those limitations, and she didn't know whether she was witnessing the return of healthy hope or the beginning of devastating disappointment. Mark Lopez's pickup truck pulled into their circular driveway at 7 o'clock, its engine sounding rough but reliable in the evening quiet. Victoria met him at the door with the nervous energy of someone about to make a decision that could change everything or destroy the careful peace they had built around Lawrence's condition. "Mr. Lopez," she said, "I need you to tell me exactly what you think you can do for my son." And I need you to be completely honest about the risks of giving him hope that might be false." Mark looked at her with the steady gaze of someone who understood the weight of promises made to desperate parents. "Mrs. Ashford Smith, I can't promise your son will walk again. But I can promise that if there's any possibility of recovery, we won't find it by accepting that none exists." As they walked toward the house, Victoria realized she was about to cross a line between the safety of accepted limitations and the dangerous territory of impossible hope. Behind them, Lawrence waited by his window, watching for the return of the man who had spoken about his future as if it held possibilities that medical science had declared extinct. Mark Lopez sat at the Ashford Smith family's kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that Victoria had poured with the nervous precision of someone stalling for time. Lawrence had positioned his wheelchair directly across from Mark, his intelligent eyes fixed on this man who had suggested that 18 months of medical certainty might be wrong. "Lecto. Before I explain what I think I can do," Mark began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who understood the weight of words spoken to desperate families, "I need you both to understand that everything I'm about to tell you goes against conventional medical wisdom. The doctors who've treated Lawrence aren't wrong about what they've observed. They're only wrong about what's possible." Victoria found herself leaning forward despite her scientific skepticism. "What exactly did you see during your military service that makes you believe spinal cord injuries can heal?" Mark pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photograph that showed a young Marine in dress blues, standing at attention beside a flag-draped ceremony stage. "This is Corporal Danny Reeves. Complete T11 spinal cord injury from an IED blast in Fallujah. Every neurologist at Bethesda Naval Hospital confirmed total paralysis below the waist. 18 months later, he walked across this stage to receive his Purple Heart." Lawrence's breath caught audibly. "He could walk again? Really walk?" "Really walk," Mark confirmed, scrolling to another photo that showed the same Marine jogging on a beach, his gait slightly uneven but unmistakably functional. Not perfectly, not like before his injury, but well enough to live independently, to play with his kids, to have a life that no wheelchair could contain. Victoria studied the photos with the analytical eye of someone trained to spot deception or wishful interpretation. What treatment did he receive? What technology was used? Mark's answer surprised her with its simplicity. Physical manipulation, electrical stimulation, and what the medical establishment would probably call aggressive wishful thinking. No experimental drugs, no cutting-edge technology, no procedures that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. "That's impossible," Victoria said flatly. "If such simple treatments could reverse complete spinal cord injuries, every rehabilitation hospital in the world would be using them." Mark set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her. "Mrs. Ashford Smith, may I ask you something? In your pharmaceutical company, how many potentially revolutionary treatments have been abandoned because they couldn't be patented, because they threatened existing revenue streams, or because they didn't fit the established treatment protocols?" The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had spent 20 years in the pharmaceutical industry, and she knew exactly how many promising treatments had been shelved for reasons that had nothing to do with their effectiveness and everything to do with their profitability. "That's different," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Spinal cord injuries are neurological conditions, not market-driven pharmaceutical issues." "Are they?" Mark asked gently. "Lawrence's care over the past 18 months has probably cost close to $2 million. How much of that money went toward treatments designed to help him adapt to paralysis rather than overcome it?" Lawrence had been listening to this exchange with the intensity of someone whose entire future hung in the balance. "Mr. Lopez, what would your treatment involve? What would you actually do?" Mark turned his full attention to the boy, speaking to him directly rather than through his mother. "Lawrence, the human nervous system is incredibly adaptive. Even when the main highway between your brain and your legs has been damaged, there are often smaller pathways that can be trained to carry signals. The key is stimulating those pathways consistently and intensively enough that they develop into functional communication routes." "How?" Lawrence pressed, his voice carrying a hunger for specifics that Victoria recognized from his pre-accident curiosity about how everything worked. Mark stood and moved to where Lawrence sat in his wheelchair. "May I show you something? I promise it won't hurt, and you can tell me to stop at any time." Lawrence nodded eagerly, and Mark knelt beside the wheelchair, placing his hands on Lawrence's legs just above the knees. His touch was professional and confident, the hands of someone who had learned to read the human body through decades of experience. "The medical tests showed no sensation below your injury site," Mark said as his hands began a methodical examination of Lawrence's legs. "But sometimes the absence of conscious sensation doesn't mean the absence of neural activity." As Mark's experienced fingers worked along Lawrence's thighs and calves, applying pressure at specific points, Lawrence's expression shifted from curiosity to amazement. "I can't feel what you're doing, but something's happening. It's like an echo of feeling." Victoria felt her heart rate accelerate. "What do you mean, an echo?" Lawrence struggled to find words for sensations that existed at the very edge of his awareness. "It's not like normal feeling, but it's not nothing either. Like when you know someone's touching you even when you're asleep." Mark nodded with satisfaction. "That's exactly what I hoped to find." "Lawrence, your spinal cord injury damaged the main neural pathways, but it didn't eliminate all connection between your brain and your legs. What you're experiencing are signals traveling through alternative routes that are too weak for conscious sensation but strong enough to prove that communication is possible." Victoria's scientific training warred with the evidence she was witnessing. "Even if that's true, how would you strengthen those pathways enough to restore function?" Mark's answer revealed a treatment plan that was both elegantly simple and radically different from conventional rehabilitation. Intensive electrical stimulation to wake up dormant neural pathways combined with physical manipulation designed to encourage signal transmission. We'd work for several hours each day, gradually increasing the intensity as Lawrence's nervous system remembers how to communicate with his legs. "How long would this take?" Lawrence asked, his voice vibrating with barely contained excitement. "If it works, we should see the first signs of improvement within 2 to 3 weeks, Mark replied. "Meaningful recovery could take several months, but the initial response happens relatively quickly if the pathways are viable." Victoria found herself calculating risks and possibilities with the strategic mind that had built her business empire. What are the downsides? What could go wrong? Mark's honesty was refreshing after 18 months of medical consultations that avoided discussing the emotional costs of failed hope. "The biggest risk is disappointment. If Lawrence's neural pathways are too damaged to respond, we'll have spent months working toward an impossible goal. The physical risks are minimal. We're not using experimental drugs or invasive procedures." "But if it doesn't work," Victoria said slowly, "Lawrence will have to accept his paralysis all over again, except this time with the knowledge that we tried everything, including the impossible." Lawrence spoke up before Mark could respond. "Mom, I've been accepting my paralysis for 18 months. If there's even a small chance that I don't have to accept it forever, isn't that worth trying?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge that, once crossed, would change everything. Victoria looked at her son, this brilliant, resilient boy who had adapted to wheelchair life with grace but had never stopped hoping for something more, and realized that her choice wasn't between hope and disappointment. It was between trying and wondering forever what might have been possible. "Where would we do this treatment?" she asked, surprising herself by moving from if to how. Mark's answer revealed the practical challenges that lay ahead. "We'd need to set up a proper treatment space here in your home. The equipment isn't expensive, but it requires consistent daily sessions in a controlled environment. I'd need to be here every day for several weeks, maybe months." Victoria's business mind immediately began calculating logistics. "What about your other work, your other clients?" "Mrs. Ashford Smith," Mark said quietly, "if I can help your son walk again, everything else can wait." That evening, after Mark had left with promises to return the next day with detailed treatment plans and equipment specifications, Victoria found herself in Lawrence's room as he prepared for bed. The transformation in her son was remarkable. For the first time in 18 months, he seemed to be looking forward to tomorrow rather than simply enduring it. "Mom," Lawrence said as Victoria helped him transfer from his wheelchair to his bed, "are we really going to try this?" Victoria looked into her son's eyes and saw the same determined intelligence that had made him fearless on diving boards and soccer fields before his accident. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "We're going to try everything." "Even if the doctors think we're crazy?" "Especially if the doctors think we're crazy," Victoria replied, realizing that somewhere during the evening's conversation she had crossed from protective skepticism to fierce determination. Sometimes the impossible just means no one's figured out how to make it possible yet. As Lawrence settled into sleep with a smile that Victoria hadn't seen since before his accident, She found herself making mental lists of everything that would need to change. She would need to clear her schedule, restructure her work commitments, and prepare for the possibility that the next few months might either restore her son's mobility or teach them both painful lessons about the difference between hope and delusion. But as she watched Lawrence sleep with the peaceful expression of someone who finally had something to dream about, Victoria realized that the choice had never really been hers to make. From the moment Mark Lopez had suggested that Lawrence's paralysis might not be permanent, her son had already committed to believing in possibilities that medical science had declared extinct. Tomorrow they would begin the most important experiment of their lives. Not in a laboratory or hospital, but in their own home, guided by a handyman who believed that fixing broken bodies wasn't fundamentally different from fixing broken machines. It just required the right tools, the right knowledge, and the willingness to work toward solutions that others had declared impossible. 3 weeks into Mark's unconventional treatment program, the transformed pool house had become mission control for the most audacious medical experiment Victoria had ever witnessed. What had once been a casual entertainment space now resembled a high-tech rehabilitation facility, equipped with electrical stimulation devices, specialized massage tables, and monitoring equipment that tracked every minuscule change in Lawrence's neurological responses. Mark arrived each morning at 6:30 sharp, his pickup truck now a familiar sight in the Ashford-Smith driveway. He carried himself with the focused determination of someone embarking on a mission where failure wasn't just professional disappointment. It was the crushing of a 12-year-old boy's dreams and a mother's desperate faith in impossible possibilities. "Good morning, Lawrence," Mark called as he entered the pool house treatment center, his voice carrying the easy confidence that had become the soundtrack of their daily routine. "Ready to convince your nervous system to remember what it used to know?" Lawrence, already positioned on the treatment table in shorts and a t-shirt, grinned with anticipation that would have been unimaginable a month earlier. "I've been thinking about yesterday's session all night. That tingling sensation in my right foot, it felt stronger than before." Victoria, who had taken indefinite leave from her pharmaceutical company to oversee every aspect of Lawrence's treatment, looked up from the detailed journal where she documented each session's progress with scientific precision. "Tell Mark exactly what you felt and when." Over the past 3 weeks, Victoria had transformed from skeptical observer to meticulous chronicler of her son's recovery. She recorded every sensation Lawrence reported, every measurement Mark took, every subtle change in muscle tone or nerve response. If this experiment was going to succeed or fail, she was determined to have irrefutable documentation of the process. Mark began the morning session by connecting Lawrence to the electrical stimulation device, a sophisticated piece of equipment that delivered precisely calibrated pulses to specific points along his legs and lower back. The machine hummed quietly as it sent signals designed to wake up dormant neural pathways that had been silent since the diving accident. "Week 3 is when we typically start seeing the breakthrough responses," Mark explained as he adjusted the stimulation intensity based on Lawrence's feedback. "Your nervous system has been relearning how to communicate with your legs, and we're approaching the point where that communication might become strong enough for conscious control." Lawrence lay perfectly still during the 45-minute stimulation session, his face a mask of concentration as he focused on detecting any sensation, any signal that his brain was successfully reconnecting with his paralyzed limbs. The electrical pulses created no visible movement, but Mark's experienced hands could detect subtle changes in muscle tone that suggested neural activity was increasing. "There," Lawrence said suddenly, his voice tight with excitement, "in my left ankle. It's not exactly feeling, but it's like my brain knows something's happening there." Mark immediately made notes on his tablet, documenting the location, intensity, and duration of Lawrence's sensory experience. "That's exactly what we want. Your brain is starting to receive signals from areas that have been silent for 18 months. It's weak communication, but it's communication." Victoria felt her heart racing as she watched her son describe sensations that medical textbooks declared impossible. 3 weeks ago, Lawrence's legs had been completely unresponsive, as lifeless as mannequin limbs. Now he was reporting regular episodes of tingling, pressure awareness, and what he described as phantom movement, where his brain seemed to be sending signals even though his legs weren't responding visibly. The afternoon session focused on passive movement exercises where Mark manipulated Lawrence's legs through range-of-motion activities, while the boy concentrated on trying to assist the movements mentally. These sessions had evolved from purely mechanical manipulation to something approaching collaborative effort as Lawrence's neurological responses grew stronger. "I want you to try something different today," Mark said as he began working with Lawrence's right leg. "Instead of just thinking about moving your knee, I want you to imagine that you're actually controlling the movement. Pretend that your leg is responding to your mental commands." Lawrence closed his eyes and furrowed his brow in concentration, his face showing the intense mental effort of trying to reconnect with parts of his body that had been lost to paralysis. As Mark guided his leg through a gentle bending motion, Lawrence's expression suddenly changed. "Wait," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do that again, but slower." Mark repeated the knee-bending motion with deliberate slowness, watching Lawrence's face for any sign of the breakthrough they had been working toward for weeks. "I felt it," Lawrence said, his eyes snapping open with an intensity that made Victoria catch her breath. "Not like pressure or tingling, but like actual feeling, like my knee is bending because I'm telling it to bend." Victoria moved closer to the treatment table, her scientific training warring with maternal hope. "Are you certain? Describe exactly what you experienced." Lawrence struggled to put words to sensations that existed at the very edge of medical possibility. "It's like when you're dreaming that you're moving, except instead of waking up and realizing it was just a dream, I'm waking up and realizing it might be real." Mark's hands continued their methodical work on Lawrence's legs, but his expression carried the focused excitement of someone witnessing a breakthrough that conventional medicine insisted couldn't happen. "Lawrence, I'm going to try something. I want you to close your eyes and tell me which leg I'm working with." For the next 10 minutes, Mark alternated between Lawrence's right and left legs, manipulating different joints and muscle groups while the boy identified which limb was being moved with increasing accuracy. Victoria documented each correct identification, her journal filling with evidence that Lawrence's sensory awareness was expanding rapidly. 93% accuracy, she announced when the exercise concluded. "That's far beyond random chance." The implications of Lawrence's improving neural connectivity extended beyond mere sensation. During physical therapy sessions with Dr. Crawford, Lawrence had begun demonstrating what the rehabilitation specialist diplomatically called improved muscle tone. His legs, which had been completely flaccid since the accident, were beginning to show subtle signs of tension that suggested some level of neural input was reaching his paralyzed muscles. His reflexes are also changing. Dr. Crawford had confided to Victoria during their weekly progress meeting. Not normal reflexes, but responses that shouldn't exist if his spinal cord injury were as complete as we initially diagnosed. Victoria had chosen not to tell Dr. Crawford about Mark's unconventional treatment program. The risk of professional interference, insurance complications, and official medical disapproval seemed too high when Lawrence was making undeniable progress. That evening, as Victoria helped Lawrence transfer from his wheelchair to his bed, she noticed something that made her pause. For the briefest moment, as Lawrence shifted his weight, his right leg seemed to provide slight resistance rather than remaining completely passive. "Lawrence," she said carefully, "when you moved just now, did you feel anything unusual?" Lawrence considered the question with the serious attention he had learned to give to every potential sign of improvement. I think my leg tried to help. Not enough to actually support me, but like, it remembered what it's supposed to do." Victoria made a note in her journal, adding this observation to the growing catalog of small improvements that, individually, might be dismissed as wishful thinking, but collectively painted a picture of genuine neurological recovery. The transformation in Lawrence extended beyond physical improvements. His personality, which had grown cautious and reserved during 18 months of adapting to disability, was re-emerging with enthusiasm and curiosity that Victoria hadn't seen since before the accident. He asked questions about neuroplasticity, researched spinal cord anatomy on his tablet, and spoke about future plans with a confidence that assumed mobility rather than wheelchair dependence. "Mark says that if the progress continues at this rate, I might start attempting assisted standing exercises next week," Lawrence told Victoria as she tucked him into bed. "Not walking yet, but actually supporting some of my own weight." Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes as she looked at her son's face, bright with hope and determination that no amount of money had been able to purchase from the medical establishment. "How do you feel about that possibility?" "Scared," Lawrence admitted with characteristic honesty. "But the good kind of scared. Like before a big soccer game when you know you might win something amazing." As Victoria turned off Lawrence's bedroom light, she found herself marveling at how dramatically their lives had changed in just 3 weeks. The impossible was slowly becoming possible, one small improvement at a time, guided by a handyman whose unconventional methods were producing results that the world's most expensive medical technology had failed to achieve. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Mark. "Tomorrow we try assisted standing. Lawrence's neural responses suggest he might be ready to support partial weight. This could be the breakthrough we've been working toward." Victoria stared at the message, understanding that tomorrow might bring either vindication of their faith in the impossible or the beginning of their most devastating disappointment yet. But as she listened to Lawrence's peaceful breathing from his bedroom, she realized that the journey itself had already transformed them both in ways that had nothing to do with whether he would ultimately walk again. They had chosen hope over resignation, possibility over medical certainty, and faith in the human body's capacity for healing over acceptance of expert limitations. Win or lose, they were no longer the same people who had given up 18 months ago when the specialists declared Lawrence's case hopeless. The call came on a Thursday morning while Lawrence was in the middle of his most successful standing session yet, his legs trembling with the effort of supporting 30% of his body weight, while Mark provided stabilization from behind. Victoria's phone rang with the distinctive tone she had assigned to her assistant Rebecca, interrupting what should have been a moment of pure celebration. "Mrs. Ashford Smith." Rebecca's voice carried the tight professionalism she reserved for delivering unwelcome news. "Dr. Crawford is here at the house. He says it's urgent that he speak with you immediately. He seems concerned about something." Victoria felt her stomach drop as she watched Lawrence maintain his standing position for another full minute, his face radiant with the achievement of supporting his own weight for the first time in 18 months. "Tell him I'll be right there. And Rebecca, don't mention anything about what we're doing in the pool house." The timing couldn't have been worse. Lawrence had just achieved a breakthrough that should have been medically impossible, and now his primary rehabilitation specialist was demanding an unscheduled meeting. Victoria's instincts, honed by 20 years of navigating corporate politics, screamed that someone had discovered their unconventional treatment program. "What's wrong, Mom?" Lawrence asked as Mark helped him back into his wheelchair, the boy's excitement dimming as he read the tension in his mother's expression. "Probably nothing," Victoria lied smoothly. "Dr. Crawford just wants to discuss your progress. Mark, can you continue the session while I handle this?" As Victoria walked from the pool house to the main mansion, she mentally prepared for the confrontation she suspected was coming. Dr. Crawford had been Lawrence's rehabilitation specialist since 2 months after the accident, a kind man whose genuine concern for his patients was matched only by his rigid adherence to established medical protocols. She found Dr. Crawford in the living room, his usually calm demeanor replaced by an agitation that made Victoria's defensive instincts flare. Beside him sat Dr. Patricia Henley from the Neurological Institute, her presence transforming what should have been a routine consultation into something that felt uncomfortably like an intervention. "Victoria," Dr. Crawford began without his usual pleasantries, "we need to discuss some concerning reports about Lawrence's treatment." Victoria settled into the chair across from them with the measured composure she had learned during hostile board meetings. "What kind of reports?" Dr. Henley leaned forward with the serious expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. "We've received information suggesting that Lawrence is receiving unauthorized medical treatment from an unlicensed practitioner, someone with no formal training in spinal cord rehabilitation." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. Someone had been watching them, reporting their activities to the medical establishment that had declared Lawrence's case hopeless. "I'm not sure what you mean," Victoria said carefully. "Lawrence receives all his medical care through properly licensed professionals." Dr. Crawford's expression grew more troubled. "Victoria, Lawrence's muscle tone has changed dramatically over the past 3 weeks. His reflexes are showing responses that shouldn't exist if his spinal cord injury were as complete as we diagnosed. These changes suggest some form of intensive intervention that goes far beyond standard rehabilitation protocols." Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied moments when everything she cared about hung in the balance. Isn't it possible that Lawrence's body is simply healing naturally? That your initial diagnosis might have been incomplete? Dr. Henley's response carried the weight of professional authority challenged. "Complete spinal cord injuries don't heal naturally, Victoria. The changes we're observing in Lawrence could only result from experimental intervention that carries significant risks for a developing child. What risks? Victoria asked, though she dreaded the answer. Dr. Crawford pulled out a tablet and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. Unlicensed electrical stimulation therapy can cause nerve damage, cardiac arrhythmias, and psychological trauma from false hope. If Lawrence is receiving such treatment, we have an ethical obligation to ensure his safety. The irony was devastating. Lawrence had made more progress in 3 weeks with Mark than in 18 months of conventional rehabilitation, yet the medical establishment was framing that progress as dangerous rather than miraculous. Furthermore, Dr. Henley continued, if unauthorized medical treatment is being provided to a minor, we're required to report it to Child Protective Services and the State Medical Board. Victoria felt the room spinning as the implications became clear. They weren't just questioning Mark's methods. They were threatening to have Lawrence removed from her custody for pursuing treatment that was actually working. "I need to ask you directly," Dr. Crawford said, his voice carrying reluctant authority. "Is Lawrence receiving any form of experimental treatment from someone named Mark Lopez?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Victoria could lie and risk criminal charges if they discovered the truth, or she could admit to the treatment and face immediate intervention from authorities who would stop Lawrence's recovery, just as it was beginning to succeed. Before Victoria could answer, Lawrence's voice came from the doorway. "Yes, he is, and it's working." Victoria's heart stopped as she turned to see her son in his wheelchair, Mark standing behind him with an expression that mixed protectiveness with resigned determination. Lawrence had clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand what was at stake. "Lawrence," Dr. Crawford said gently, "Son, we're concerned that you might be receiving treatment that could hurt you rather than help you." Lawrence wheeled himself into the center of the room with the confident movement of someone who had found his voice. "Dr. Crawford, 3 weeks ago I couldn't feel anything below my waist. This morning I stood up and supported my own weight. How is that hurting me?" Dr. Henley exchanged glances with Dr. Crawford before responding. "Lawrence, sometimes our bodies can seem to improve temporarily, especially when we want something very badly. But actual spinal cord regeneration isn't possible with current medical technology." "Then maybe your medical technology isn't as advanced as you think," Lawrence replied with the devastating logic of childhood unencumbered by professional politeness. Mark stepped forward, his presence bringing a calm authority to the charged atmosphere. "Dr. Crawford, Dr. Henley, I understand your concerns about Lawrence's treatment, but before you decide to stop something that's clearly working, wouldn't it be more scientific to evaluate the results rather than the credentials of the person achieving them?" Dr. Henley's response carried the defensive edge of someone whose expertise was being questioned. "Mr. Lopez, I presume, your background is in military field medicine, not neurological rehabilitation. The human spinal cord isn't something that can be fixed like a broken machine." "With respect, Doctor," Mark replied, "I've seen broken spinal cords heal when the right approach was used consistently. Lawrence's improvement isn't theoretical, it's measurable, documented, and accelerating." Dr. Crawford stood with the resigned expression of someone fulfilling an unpleasant duty. "I'm sorry, but we can't allow experimental treatment to continue without proper oversight. Lawrence's safety has to be our primary concern." Victoria felt panic rising in her chest as she realized they were about to lose everything they had worked toward. "What are you saying exactly?" "We're saying that all unauthorized treatment must cease immediately," Dr. Henley announced with bureaucratic finality. "Lawrence will resume standard rehabilitation protocols under proper medical supervision." The words fell like a death sentence on 18 months of hope. Lawrence had been making impossible progress, defying medical certainty with improvements that should have been celebrated rather than criminalized. Now the same establishment that had failed him was using its authority to prevent his recovery. "And if we refuse?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dr. Crawford's response confirmed her worst fears. "Then we'll be forced to involve Child Protective Services to ensure Lawrence receives appropriate medical care." Lawrence looked between the doctors and his mother with the mature understanding of someone whose entire future was being decided by adults who prioritized protocol over progress. "So you're going to stop my treatment because it's working too well to be believable?" The question exposed the fundamental absurdity of their situation. The medical establishment that had declared Lawrence's case hopeless was now threatening to prevent his recovery because it challenged their professional certainty about what was possible. Victoria stood with the determined expression of someone who had spent 20 years fighting for business victories against impossible odds. "Doctors, I appreciate your concern for Lawrence's welfare, but I'm not going to allow you to stop treatment that's giving my son his life back." Dr. Henley's expression hardened. "Mrs. Ashford Smith, this isn't a negotiation. If Mr. Lopez continues providing unauthorized medical treatment to your son, we'll have no choice but to take legal action to protect Lawrence from potentially harmful experimental procedures." As the doctors prepared to leave with ultimatums and threats, Victoria realized that their greatest victory was about to become their most devastating defeat. Lawrence had defied medical impossibility by beginning to walk again, but the system that should have celebrated his recovery was instead mobilizing to prevent it. The battle for Lawrence's future was no longer between paralysis and recovery. It was between bureaucratic authority and parental determination, between established protocol and innovative breakthrough, between playing it safe and fighting for the impossible. Outside, Mark's pickup truck sat in the driveway like a symbol of hope under siege, ready to drive away with the only treatment that had ever given Lawrence a real chance at walking again. But now that chance was threatened not by medical limitations, but by the very establishment that should have been leading the fight for his recovery. The legal documents arrived by certified mail on Monday morning, delivered by a courier who seemed apologetic about handing Victoria papers that could destroy her family's last hope for Lawrence's recovery. The thick envelope bore the official seal of the State Medical Board, and its contents transformed their private struggle into a public legal battle with consequences that extended far beyond their personal situation. Victoria sat in her home office, surrounded by the medical files that had once documented Lawrence's hopeless condition, but now served as evidence that conventional medicine had failed, where Mark's unconventional methods were succeeding. The legal complaint painted a picture that bore no resemblance to their reality. Unlicensed medical practitioner endangering disabled minor through experimental procedures lacking scientific basis or regulatory approval. The irony was staggering. Lawrence had achieved more functional improvement in 4 weeks than in 18 months of conventional treatment, yet the legal system was framing his recovery as child endangerment rather than medical breakthrough. Rebecca knocked softly before entering with a cup of coffee and an expression that Victoria had learned to associate with complicated news. "Mrs. Ashford Smith, there's a representative from Prometheus Rehabilitation Industries here to see you. He says it's regarding Lawrence's case." Victoria felt her stomach tighten. Prometheus was one of the largest manufacturers of rehabilitation equipment in the world, a company that profited enormously from the long-term management of spinal cord injuries. Their interest in Lawrence's case suggested that word of his recovery was spreading beyond medical circles into corporate boardrooms. The man who entered her office wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to making offers that couldn't be refused. "Mrs. Ashford Smith, I'm David Sterling from Prometheus Rehabilitation. I understand you're facing some challenging legal issues regarding your son's treatment." Victoria gestured to the chair across from her desk while maintaining the neutral expression she had perfected during hostile business negotiations. "Mr. Sterling, I'm curious why a rehabilitation equipment company would be interested in a private medical matter." Sterling's smile carried the calculated warmth of someone whose friendliness served strategic purposes. "Mrs. Ashford Smith, your son's case has attracted significant attention in medical circles. If Mr. Lopez's methods have legitimate therapeutic value, Prometheus would be very interested in acquiring the rights to develop them into properly regulated treatment protocols." The offer was as predictable as it was insulting. Corporate America's solution to medical breakthrough was always the same. Control the innovation, standardize the delivery, maximize the profit, and eliminate any practitioner who couldn't be regulated into compliance. "What exactly are you proposing?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew. Sterling opened his briefcase and withdrew a contract thick enough to choke a horse. "We're prepared to offer Mr. Lopez a substantial consulting fee to work with our research division in developing his techniques for clinical application. We're also prepared to cover all legal expenses associated with your current situation." Victoria scanned the contract summary page, her pharmaceutical industry experience allowing her to decode the corporate language that transformed innovative treatment into proprietary intellectual property. And, in exchange, Mr. Lopez would agree to cease all independent practice and transfer his methods to Prometheus for proper development and regulatory approval, a process that typically takes 18 to 24 months. The timeline was devastating. Lawrence was making breakthrough progress right now, but Prometheus wanted to halt his treatment for 2 years, while they packaged Mark's methods into products that could be sold to rehabilitation facilities worldwide. "What happens to Lawrence during this development period?" Victoria asked, though the answer was obvious. Sterling's expression didn't change, but his voice carried the casual indifference of someone discussing market statistics rather than a child's future. Lawrence would resume standard rehabilitation protocols until Prometheus-approved treatment becomes available through proper medical channels. Victoria felt rage building in her chest as she understood the full scope of what was being offered. Corporate America was willing to help them avoid legal troubles, but only if they surrendered Lawrence's recovery to a development timeline that prioritized profit over his immediate needs. "Mr. Sterling," Victoria said with the cold politeness she reserved for business adversaries, "you're asking us to sacrifice my son's current progress for the possibility of future treatment that may or may not be available when he needs it." Sterling's response revealed the corporate mindset that treated human suffering as market opportunity. "Mrs. Ashford Smith, individual cases can't dictate medical policy. If Mr. Lopez's methods have genuine therapeutic value, they need to be properly studied and regulated before being applied to vulnerable patient populations." The meeting ended with Victoria declining Prometheus's offer, and Sterling departing with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed corporate threats. But his visit had revealed the broader forces aligning against Lawrence's recovery. Not just medical bureaucracy, but the corporate interest that profited from managing spinal cord injuries rather than curing them. That afternoon brought even worse news. Rebecca handed Victoria a printed email from Dr. Martinez at Johns Hopkins, forwarding a communication from the International Association of Neurological Rehabilitation. The organization was calling for a formal investigation into, quote, unsubstantiated claims of spinal cord recovery, and warning member institutions about practitioners making promises that exceed current medical capabilities. Lawrence's case had become a symbol of everything the medical establishment found threatening about unconventional treatment. His improvement challenged not just individual diagnoses, but the entire infrastructure of spinal cord injury management that employed thousands of professionals and generated billions in revenue annually. The pressure intensified when Victoria received a call from her own company's board of directors. Thomas Blackwell, the chairman who had approved her indefinite leave, delivered news that transformed her personal crisis into professional catastrophe. "Victoria," Thomas's voice carried the uncomfortable authority of someone bearing unwelcome tidings. "The board has received inquiries about your involvement in controversial medical practices. There are concerns about how this situation might affect the company's reputation in the pharmaceutical industry." Victoria felt the walls closing in from every direction. "Thomas, this is a private family matter. It has nothing to do with my professional responsibilities." "I wish that were true," Thomas replied. "But when the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company publicly challenges established medical protocols, it becomes a corporate issue. The board is requesting that you either distance yourself from this experimental treatment or consider extending your leave indefinitely." The ultimatum was clear. Choose between her son's recovery and her career, between Lawrence's future and her own professional survival. Victoria had spent 20 years building her position in the pharmaceutical industry, but 18 months watching her son adapt to paralysis had taught her what truly mattered. "Thomas," Victoria said with quiet determination, "if the board has a problem with a mother fighting for her son's recovery, then perhaps I'm working for the wrong company." The conversation ended with Victoria's effective resignation from the pharmaceutical empire she had helped build. A sacrifice that would have seemed unthinkable 6 months earlier but now felt like the only choice that preserved her integrity. Meanwhile, Mark faced his own escalating pressures. The state medical board had issued a cease and desist order that made any continued treatment of Lawrence a criminal offense punishable by fines and imprisonment. His modest handyman business was being investigated for unlicensed medical practice, and former clients were being contacted by investigators looking for evidence of similar violations. "I can't ask you to risk everything for my son," Victoria told Mark during an emergency meeting in the Pool House Treatment Center. "You've already done more than anyone had a right to expect." Mark looked at Lawrence, who was sitting quietly in his wheelchair but whose legs now showed visible muscle tone and occasional involuntary movement that suggested neural reconnection was accelerating. "Mrs. Ashford Smith," Mark said quietly, "I've spent 8 years helping people adapt to disabilities because I believed that was the best I could offer. But Lawrence has shown me that sometimes the best we can offer is a cure that the medical establishment doesn't want to acknowledge." Lawrence spoke up with the mature voice of someone whose childhood had been defined by adult decisions about his body. "What happens if we stop the treatment now?" Mark's honesty was both brutal and necessary. "The progress you've made will probably be permanent, but the momentum will stop. Your nervous system is right at the point where major breakthroughs become possible. If we halt treatment now, you'll be better than when we started, but you may never walk independently." The choice was impossible. Continue treatment and face criminal charges, corporate retaliation and social services intervention, or surrender to legal pressure and accept partial recovery when complete healing might be within reach. That evening, Victoria sat with Lawrence in his room as they faced the most difficult decision of their lives. Outside, Mark's pickup truck waited in their driveway like a symbol of hope under siege, ready to drive away with the only treatment that had ever given Lawrence a real chance at walking. "Mom," Lawrence said quietly, "what are we going to do?" Victoria looked at her son, this brave, intelligent boy who had never asked to be the center of a battle between medical innovation and bureaucratic control, and realized that some fights were worth any cost. "We're going to finish what we started," she said with the fierce determination of someone who had nothing left to lose except her son's future. "Whatever the consequences, we're going to see how far your recovery can go." The war for Lawrence's healing had escalated beyond medical disagreement into a battle for the right to pursue impossible cures when established medicine had given up hope. Tomorrow would bring new threats, new pressures, new attempts to force them into compliance with a system that prioritized process over progress. But tonight, Lawrence fell asleep knowing that his mother was willing to risk everything for his chance to walk again, and Victoria fell asleep planning the most important act of defiance in her life. The convoy of official vehicles arrived at the Ashford Smith mansion at exactly 9 o'clock on Friday morning, their synchronized arrival suggesting careful coordination between multiple agencies. Victoria watched from her office window as unmarked sedans disgorged investigators from the state medical board while a sheriff's department patrol car positioned itself to block the driveway exit. Behind them came a white van bearing the logo of Child Protective Services, its presence transforming their family crisis into a child welfare emergency. Rebecca burst into Victoria's office without knocking, her usual professional composure shattered by the scope of the official response. "Mrs. Ashford Smith, there are 7 people at the front door with legal documents. They're demanding immediate access to Lawrence and Mr. Lopez." Victoria felt the familiar calm that descended during moments of absolute crisis, the executive mindset that had served her through corporate emergencies, now focusing on protecting her son from a system that viewed his recovery as evidence of child endangerment. Where are Lawrence and Mark? In the pool house. Lawrence was having his best session yet. He actually took 3 independent steps this morning. The irony was devastating. Lawrence had achieved the breakthrough they had been working toward for weeks, taking his first independent steps since the diving accident, just as the authorities arrived to halt his recovery permanently. Victoria walked to the front door with the measured dignity of someone who had spent 20 years dealing with hostile negotiations. The group waiting on her doorstep represented the full force of institutional authority. Dr. Patricia Henley from the Neurological Institute, Sarah Morrison from Child Protective Services, Detective James Walsh from the Sheriff's Department, and 4 investigators whose business cards identified them as representing various state medical and legal agencies. "Mrs. Ashford Smith," Dr. Henley said with the professional courtesy that barely concealed bureaucratic triumph, "we have court orders requiring immediate cessation of all unauthorized medical treatment and assessment of Lawrence's current condition by qualified medical professionals." Detective Walsh stepped forward with documents that carried the weight of judicial authority. "We also have a warrant to search the premises for evidence of unlicensed medical practice and to interview all parties involved in Lawrence's treatment." Victoria accepted the legal papers with hands that remained steady, despite the magnitude of what was being demanded. The court orders were comprehensive and devastating. Immediate halt to all experimental treatment, removal of medical equipment from the premises, psychiatric evaluation of Lawrence to assess potential psychological damage from false hope, and criminal investigation of Mark Lopez for practicing medicine without a license. "I assume you'll want to speak with Lawrence," Victoria said, her voice carrying the controlled politeness of someone buying time to think. Sarah Morrison from Child Protective Services consulted a tablet that contained what appeared to be a detailed case file. "Mrs. Ashford-Smith, we've received reports that your son is being subjected to experimental medical procedures by an unlicensed practitioner. We need to assess whether Lawrence is in immediate danger and determine appropriate protective measures." The language was clinical and devastating. Lawrence's recovery was being framed not as medical breakthrough, but as child abuse requiring protective intervention. Victoria understood that the next few hours would determine whether her son continued his remarkable recovery or was forced back into the hopeless paralysis that conventional medicine had declared permanent. "Before you speak with Lawrence," Victoria said carefully, "I think you should observe his current functional capacity. When you filed these complaints, what were you told about his condition?" Dr. Henley consulted her own documentation. "Complete T12 spinal cord injury with permanent paralysis of both lower extremities. No sensation or voluntary movement below the injury site." Victoria gestured toward the pool house, where Lawrence and Mark were continuing their session despite the official vehicles in the driveway. "Then perhaps you should see what a child in immediate danger looks like." The group followed Victoria across the manicured lawn to the pool house, their formal procession resembling a judicial march toward evidence that would either vindicate or condemn everything the family had risked. Through the glass doors, they could see Lawrence standing at the parallel bars, his legs trembling with effort but clearly supporting his weight, while Mark provided minimal assistance from behind. Dr. Henley stopped walking as if she had encountered a physical barrier. "That's not possible. Complete spinal cord injuries don't recover spontaneous function." Inside the pool house, Lawrence was taking careful steps between the parallel bars, his movements slow and deliberate but unmistakably voluntary. Each step represented 18 months of medical impossibility being overturned by practical reality. Detective Walsh spoke into his radio with the confused tone of someone whose investigation had been complicated by evidence that contradicted the basis for their intervention. "Dispatch, the alleged victim appears to be mobile. Please advise on how to proceed." Sarah Morrison from Child Protective Services watched Lawrence's progress with the expression of someone whose professional worldview was being challenged by a 12-year-old boy's determination to walk. "Mrs. Ashford-Smith, we were told that your son was being subjected to harmful experimental procedures. What we're observing suggests the opposite." Mark noticed the official delegation gathered outside and helped Lawrence into his wheelchair before approaching the doors. His expression carried the resigned dignity of someone who had anticipated this moment since beginning Lawrence's treatment. "I assume you're here about Lawrence's recovery," Mark said as he opened the doors to face the assembled authorities. "Before you arrest me for helping a paralyzed child walk again, wouldn't you like to understand how it was accomplished?" Dr. Henley's response revealed the fundamental conflict between medical establishment authority and practical results. "Mr. Lopez, regardless of what appears to be happening, you've been providing medical treatment without proper licensing or oversight. The fact that the patient seems to be responding doesn't authorize unlicensed practice." Lawrence wheeled himself forward with the confident movement of someone who had learned to advocate for his own recovery. "Dr. Henley, I know you think what you're seeing is impossible. But impossible things happen when people refuse to accept limitations that others consider permanent." The 12-year-old's words carried weight that silenced the adults who had come to protect him from treatment that was actually healing him. Lawrence had spoken with the moral authority of someone whose body was proving that medical certainty was sometimes just another word for giving up too early. Detective Walsh found himself in the unprecedented position of investigating child endangerment that had resulted in a disabled child's recovery. "Mrs. Ashford-Smith, I need to understand exactly what treatment has been provided and what risks your son might have faced." Victoria gestured to the treatment equipment that had been the target of so much official concern. "Detective, my son has received electrical stimulation therapy, physical manipulation, and intensive rehabilitation exercises. The risks included possible disappointment if the treatment failed. The results include Lawrence taking his first independent steps in 18 months. The investigation that should have been straightforward, unlicensed practitioner endangers disabled child, had become a complex examination of medical innovation versus regulatory compliance. The authorities had arrived, expecting to find evidence of harmful experimentation, and instead discovered a child whose impossible recovery challenged everything they understood about spinal cord injuries. Sarah Morrison requested a private interview with Lawrence to assess his psychological state and determine whether he had been pressured into participating in risky treatment. The conversation, conducted in the mansion's library while the other officials waited outside, revealed the mature perspective of someone whose recovery had been earned through weeks of disciplined effort. "Lawrence," Morrison said gently, "I need to understand if you felt pressured to participate in this treatment, or if you were properly informed about the risks involved." Lawrence's response demonstrated wisdom that exceeded his 12 years. "Ms. Morrison, for 18 months, every doctor told me I would never walk again. Mr. Lopez was the first person who suggested that maybe they were wrong. I chose to find out." "But didn't you worry about the risks? About what might happen if the treatment didn't work?" Lawrence's answer cut to the heart of the entire controversy. "Ms. Morrison, I was already paralyzed. The worst-case scenario was staying exactly the same. The best-case scenario was walking again. Those seemed like acceptable odds." When the officials reconvened to discuss their findings, they faced an impossible situation. The child they had come to protect was demonstrably better than when the complaints were filed. The treatment they had come to halt was producing results that conventional medicine had declared impossible. The practitioner they had come to arrest was achieving breakthroughs that licensed professionals had failed to accomplish. Dr. Henley delivered the verdict with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Lopez, while Lawrence appears to be responding positively to your intervention, you're still practicing medicine without proper licensing. The court orders remain in effect, and all treatment must cease immediately." The words fell like a death sentence on the most successful medical intervention Lawrence had ever received. His recovery would be halted not because it was failing, but because it was succeeding too well to fit within established regulatory frameworks. Mark looked at Lawrence, then at Victoria, understanding that their remarkable journey was being terminated by the very system that should have been celebrating their breakthrough. "Lawrence has made extraordinary progress. Stopping his treatment now would be like interrupting surgery in the middle of the procedure." But legal authority trumped medical logic. Regulatory compliance overruled practical results, and the officials began the process of dismantling the treatment program that had given Lawrence his first real hope of walking again since his diving accident 18 months earlier. As the authorities prepared to seize the treatment equipment and formally end Lawrence's recovery, Victoria realized that their greatest victory was being transformed into their most devastating defeat by a system that prioritized process over progress and feared innovation more than it celebrated healing. The secret meeting took place at 11 p.m. in the basement of St. Michael's Church, where Father Rodriguez had quietly assembled an unlikely coalition of people whose lives had been touched by Lawrence's story. The gathering resembled an underground resistance movement more than a medical planning session. Parents whose disabled children had been written off by conventional medicine, former military personnel who understood Mark's background, and community members who had watched the Ashford Smith family's 18-month journey from hope to despair to miraculous recovery. "They took everything," Mark said quietly, addressing the 23 people who had risked legal complications by attending this clandestine meeting. The electrical stimulation equipment, the treatment records, even Lawrence's progress journals. But they can't take what he's already accomplished. Victoria sat beside Mark, her pharmaceutical executive composure replaced by the fierce determination of a mother whose son's future hung in the balance. "The court order prohibits any continuation of treatment at our home or any medical facility, but it doesn't prohibit Lawrence from participating in community activities that might happen to include physical therapy." Father Rodriguez, a soft-spoken man whose parish had become a sanctuary for families struggling with medical bureaucracy, leaned forward with the conspiratorial intensity of someone accustomed to helping people navigate impossible situations. "The church gymnasium has been used for physical rehabilitation programs before. If Lawrence were to attend a community fitness gathering, that wouldn't technically violate the medical treatment prohibition." The plan that emerged over the next 2 hours was audacious in its simplicity. Lawrence would participate in a, quote, community wellness program hosted by St. Michael's Church, where Mark would provide fitness coaching rather than medical treatment. The electrical stimulation equipment had been confiscated, but Mark's knowledge of manual therapy techniques and exercise protocols couldn't be seized by court order. Elena Santos, whose daughter had cerebral palsy, spoke up with the passion of someone who had watched medical establishment fail her own child. "My Maria has been written off by doctors who say she'll never walk independently. If Lawrence can recover from complete spinal cord injury, maybe Maria can improve beyond what they've predicted for her." The meeting evolved from planning Lawrence's continued treatment to organizing a broader challenge to medical limitations that trapped families in hopeless diagnoses. Word had spread through informal networks about Lawrence's recovery, inspiring parents whose children had been declared beyond help by conventional medicine. Dr. Amanda Clark, a retired physical therapist who had attended the meeting despite professional risks, offered her expertise in disguising medical intervention as community exercise. "If we structure the activities as adaptive sports training rather than rehabilitation therapy, we can provide intensive intervention without triggering medical practice regulations." Mark outlined a treatment schedule that would maintain Lawrence's momentum while operating within legal gray areas. Morning sessions would focus on swimming instruction at the community pool, where buoyancy would allow Lawrence to practice walking movements without full weight bearing. Afternoon activities would include martial arts training that emphasized balance, coordination, and controlled movement patterns. "The key," Mark explained, "is that Lawrence is choosing to participate in community activities that happen to benefit his recovery, rather than receiving prescribed medical treatment." Victoria understood the risks they were all taking. If authorities discover that this is continuation of Lawrence's medical treatment under a different name, everyone involved could face charges for conspiracy to violate court orders. Father Rodriguez's response carried the moral authority of someone whose vocation involved protecting the vulnerable. Sometimes doing what's right requires accepting legal risks. Lawrence's recovery proves that medical impossibility is often just another word for institutional failure. The logistics of their underground operation required careful coordination. Sarah Martinez, a nurse who had taken leave from her hospital position to avoid conflict of interest, would monitor Lawrence's progress using fitness tracking methods rather than medical documentation. Tom Bradley, a former Army medic who had served with Mark overseas, would provide backup support during sessions. "We'll need communication protocols that don't create evidence of organized medical treatment," Victoria said, her corporate crisis management experience adapting to their clandestine requirements. "All coordination happens through the church's community programs office, all documentation focuses on recreational activities, and all participants are volunteers in a wellness initiative." Lawrence, who had been quietly listening to the adults plan his continued recovery, finally spoke with the determined voice of someone who had learned to advocate for his own healing. "I understand that everyone is taking risks to help me keep getting better. I won't let you down." The boy's words carried weight that silenced the room. Here was a 12-year-old who had achieved the medically impossible, only to have his recovery criminalized by the system that should have celebrated it. Now he was the center of a community conspiracy to continue healing that authorities had declared illegal. Dr. Clark raised the broader implications of their resistance movement. Lawrence's case has become a symbol of everything wrong with medical orthodoxy. If we can prove that continued improvement is possible despite official prohibition, we'll be challenging the entire establishment that profits from managing disabilities rather than curing them. The meeting concluded with specific assignments and communication protocols. Mark would arrive at St. Michael's each morning as a volunteer fitness instructor. Lawrence would participate as a community member, seeking adaptive sports training. Victoria would coordinate through the church's legitimate wellness programs while maintaining plausible deniability about medical intent. Father Rodriguez offered the closing prayer that framed their conspiracy in moral rather than legal terms. "Grant us wisdom to help this child achieve the healing that conventional medicine has declared impossible, and courage to continue, despite those who would sacrifice his recovery to preserve their professional certainty." As the group dispersed into the night, each person understood they were participating in something larger than Lawrence's individual recovery. They were challenging a medical establishment that had abandoned innovation in favor of limitation management, corporate bureaucracy that prioritized profit over healing, and regulatory systems that criminalized breakthrough rather than celebrating progress. The next morning, Lawrence arrived at St. Michael's Gymnasium for his first, quote, community wellness session. his wheelchair positioned at the entrance like a symbol of the limitations he was determined to overcome. Mark greeted him with the easy familiarity of a fitness instructor welcoming a regular participant, though both understood they were continuing the most important medical experiment of their lives under the guise of recreational activity. "Ready for swimming instruction?" Mark asked, using the coded language they had developed to describe therapeutic activities without triggering medical practice regulations. Lawrence's response carried the confidence of someone who had learned to walk again once and was prepared to do it again despite official prohibition. Ready to show them that impossible recoveries don't stop just because authorities say they have to. The pool at St. Michael's wasn't equipped with the sophisticated monitoring equipment that had documented Lawrence's progress at home, but the warm water provided the same buoyancy that allowed him to practice walking movements without full weight support. As Mark guided him through exercises disguised as swimming lessons, Lawrence's steps grew stronger and more confident with each session. Within a week, the underground treatment program was producing results that matched the progress Lawrence had made under official medical supervision. His walking endurance increased from minutes to full half-hour sessions. His balance improved enough that he could navigate shallow water without constant support. Most remarkably, sensation continued returning to areas that conventional medicine had declared permanently numb. Other families began requesting inclusion in the, quote, community wellness program, bringing children whose disabilities had been declared permanent by medical experts. Elena Santos's daughter Maria participated in, quote, dance instruction that happened to address cerebral palsy movement patterns. The Johnson family's son participated in, quote, nation games that provided therapeutic intervention for autism-related motor challenges. St. Michael's Gymnasium became an informal laboratory for medical innovation disguised as community recreation, where families discovered that impossible recoveries often happened when people stopped accepting expert limitations and started believing in possibilities that authorities had declared extinct. The underground resistance was proving that healing couldn't be halted by court orders, that recovery didn't require official sanction, and that sometimes the most important medical breakthroughs happened in church basements rather than hospital boardrooms. Lawrence was walking again, one carefully disguised step at a time, surrounded by a community conspiracy that believed impossible recoveries were worth any legal risk. The Maplewood Heights Annual Community Fair had always been a showcase for local achievement, but this year's event would become the stage for the most audacious medical demonstration in the town's history. Victoria stood at the edge of the fairgrounds, watching families arrive for what they expected to be a typical Saturday afternoon of carnival rides, craft booths, and children's activities. None of them knew they were about to witness a paralyzed boy walk publicly for the first time in 18 months, defying court orders and medical certainty in front of hundreds of witnesses. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked as he adjusted the hidden recording equipment that would document Lawrence's public demonstration. They had spent weeks planning this moment, understanding that once Lawrence walked in front of the entire community, there would be no hiding their continued treatment or denying the success of methods that authorities had criminalized. Victoria's response carried the fierce determination of someone who had sacrificed everything for this opportunity. "Mark, they can suppress individual reports, dismiss private progress, and ignore isolated cases. But they can't deny what hundreds of people witness simultaneously." The plan was brilliantly simple and incredibly risky. Lawrence would participate in the fair's adaptive sports demonstration, an annual event where local disabled children showcased their abilities in wheelchair basketball, adaptive swimming, and other modified activities. But instead of demonstrating adaptation to disability, Lawrence would demonstrate recovery from it. Father Rodriguez had coordinated with fair organizers to ensure that the adaptive sports demonstration received maximum visibility, scheduling it for the main stage during peak attendance hours. Local news crews would be present to cover the community event, unknowingly positioned to document the medical breakthrough that authorities had tried to suppress. "Ladies and gentlemen," the fair announcer's voice echoed across the grounds as crowds gathered around the main stage. "Please welcome our adaptive sports participants, showcasing the incredible achievements possible when determination meets opportunity." Lawrence sat in his wheelchair at the edge of the stage, his nervous energy barely contained as he prepared for the most important performance of his life. Beside him, 3 other children from their underground treatment program waited to demonstrate their own impossible improvements. Maria Santos, whose cerebral palsy had improved dramatically through disguised dance therapy, and twin brothers whose autism-related motor challenges had responded to their martial arts training. Victoria positioned herself where she could see both the stage and the crowd's reaction, her phone ready to stream live video that would preserve evidence of Lawrence's demonstration regardless of any attempts to suppress it afterward. In the audience, she spotted several people whose presence made her stomach tighten. Drive. Henley from the Neurological Institute, Detective Walsh from the Sheriff's Department, and representatives from the State Medical Board who had apparently heard rumors about continued treatment. Our first participant, the announcer continued, unaware that he was about to introduce a boy whose recovery would challenge everything the medical establishment believed about spinal cord injuries, is Lawrence Smith, who will demonstrate adaptive swimming techniques. Lawrence wheeled himself to the center of the stage, where a temporary pool had been set up for the demonstration. The crowd applauded politely, expecting to see adaptive swimming aids or modified flotation techniques that helped disabled children participate in water activities. Instead, Lawrence transferred from his wheelchair to the pool's edge with fluid confidence that suggested months of practice rather than adaptation to limitation. He slipped into the water with movements that were too controlled, too coordinated for someone with complete lower body paralysis. "Swimming has always been my favorite activity," Lawrence said, his voice carrying clearly across the fairgrounds through the wireless microphone he wore. "After my accident, doctors told me I would never swim normally again, but normal is just another word for what most people think is possible." As Lawrence began moving through the water, his strokes demonstrated not just upper body strength but coordinated movement that required neural input to his legs. His kicks were deliberate and controlled, providing propulsion that should have been impossible for someone with severed spinal cord connections. Dr. Henley moved closer to the stage, her expression shifting from casual observation to focused analysis as she recognized movement patterns that contradicted Lawrence's medical diagnosis. Her presence in the crowd created tension that rippled through the fair organizers who suddenly realized their adaptive sports demonstration was becoming something far more controversial. "Now I'd like to try something new," Lawrence announced as he moved to the shallow end of the pool where the water was only waist-deep, "something I've been practicing in my community wellness program." The crowd fell silent as Lawrence positioned himself at the pool's edge and slowly stood up in the shallow water. His legs trembled with effort, but they clearly supported his weight as he took his first public steps since the diving accident 18 months earlier. The gasps from the audience were audible across the fairgrounds. Parents pointed in amazement. Children stopped their activities to stare, and elderly residents who remembered Lawrence before his accident began crying as they witnessed what they had been told was medically impossible. Lawrence walked across the width of the shallow pool, his movements careful but confident, each step proving that complete spinal cord injuries weren't always as complete as medical experts claimed. When he reached the opposite edge, he turned and walked back, his endurance demonstrating weeks of hidden practice that had continued despite court orders prohibiting his treatment. Detective Walsh spoke urgently into his radio, clearly requesting guidance on how to handle a public demonstration of activity that violated court orders, while simultaneously proving that those orders had prevented legitimate medical recovery. Victoria began live streaming the demonstration on multiple social media platforms, her commentary providing real-time narration for viewers who were witnessing the impossible unfold in a small-town community fair. "This is Lawrence Smith, a 12-year-old boy who was told by 17 specialists that he would never walk again," Victoria said into her phone as Lawrence continued his demonstration. "What you're seeing is not a miracle. It's the result of treatment that was declared illegal because it worked too well to fit medical orthodoxy." The crowd's reaction grew more intense as Lawrence climbed out of the pool and walked across the stage without assistance, his steps growing stronger and more confident with each demonstration. Fair attendees began recording their own videos, creating multiple documented records of Lawrence's recovery that would be impossible to suppress or discredit. Father Rodriguez took the microphone with the moral authority of someone whose mission involved protecting the vulnerable. "What we're witnessing today is proof that impossible recoveries happen when communities support innovation over orthodoxy, when families choose hope over expert limitations, and when healers risk everything to help children achieve what conventional medicine declares impossible." Maria Santos wheeled herself onto the stage for her own demonstration, but instead of remaining in her wheelchair, she stood and walked across the platform with movements that her cerebral palsy diagnosis had declared impossible. The twin brothers followed, demonstrating coordination and motor control that contradicted their autism-related limitations. The adaptive sports demonstration had become a revolution against medical limitation, a public challenge to institutional authority that claimed impossible recoveries were dangerous fantasies rather than achievable realities. Dr. Henley approached the stage with the determined expression of someone whose professional worldview was being publicly dismantled. This demonstration must stop immediately. These children are receiving unauthorized medical treatment that violates court orders and puts them at risk. Lawrence's response carried across the fairgrounds through his wireless microphone, his 12-year-old voice speaking with the moral clarity that only children could achieve. Dr. Henley, the only risk I faced was staying paralyzed forever because experts like you gave up too early. Today I'm walking because people refuse to accept your limitations. The confrontation between established medical authority and documented recovery played out in front of hundreds of witnesses whose cell phone cameras captured every word. The community fair had become a public trial, where impossible recoveries were being proven real despite professional claims that they couldn't exist. As police arrived to enforce court orders that suddenly seemed absurd in the face of Lawrence's obvious health and mobility, the crowd began a spontaneous demonstration of support that transformed the fair into a rally for medical innovation over bureaucratic control. Victoria realized that their secret resistance had evolved into a public movement that would be impossible to suppress. Lawrence's walk across the stage had become a march toward medical freedom, community support triumphing over institutional authority, and proof that sometimes the most important healing happened when people stopped accepting expert limitations and started believing in possibilities that authorities had declared extinct. The moment of absolute vindication came not during Lawrence's carefully planned demonstration, but in the chaos that followed when Dr. Henley demanded immediate medical examination to prove that his walking was somehow fraudulent. As police officers approached the stage to enforce court orders that seemed increasingly absurd in front of hundreds of witnesses, Lawrence made a decision that would transform medical understanding forever. "Dr. Henley," Lawrence called out, his 12-year-old voice carrying across the fairgrounds with startling authority, "you want medical proof that my recovery is real? Then examine me right here, right now, in front of everyone." The challenge stopped the approaching officers in their tracks. Victoria felt her heart racing as she realized her son was proposing the most dangerous gamble possible, submitting to immediate medical evaluation that would either confirm his recovery or expose any deception to hundreds of witnesses and multiple news cameras. Dr. Henley's expression revealed the conflict between professional skepticism and the undeniable evidence of Lawrence's mobility. "Lawrence, proper medical examination requires controlled conditions, not a public stage at a community fair." "Proper medical examination told me I would never walk again," Lawrence replied, his words creating a ripple of supportive murmurs through the crowd. "Maybe it's time for improper examination that actually looks at what's really happening." Father Rodriguez stepped forward with the portable medical equipment that the underground treatment program had acquired for monitoring progress. "Dr. Henley, if you're genuinely concerned about Lawrence's welfare rather than protecting professional reputation, then examine him with whatever tools are available." The crowd began chanting encouragement that transformed the medical examination into a public test of institutional credibility versus demonstrated results. "Test him now! Test him now!" The chant grew louder as more fairgoers understood they were witnessing a confrontation between medical orthodoxy and breakthrough recovery. Dr. Henley found herself trapped between professional protocol and public pressure, with news cameras documenting her every response. Refusing to examine Lawrence would suggest she feared what honest evaluation might reveal, but conducting the examination risked confirming recovery that contradicted everything she had taught about spinal cord injuries. "Very well," Dr. Henley announced with obvious reluctance, "but I want it clearly understood that this is not standard medical protocol." Mark wheeled a portable examination table onto the stage while Lawrence positioned himself for the most important medical test of his life. The crowd fell silent as Dr. Henley began testing Lawrence's reflexes, muscle tone, and sensory responses with equipment borrowed from the underground treatment program. "Patellar reflex present and symmetrical," Dr. Henley announced to the crowd, her voice revealing surprise at finding responses that shouldn't exist with complete spinal cord injury. "Achilles reflex responsive bilaterally." Victoria held her breath as the examination continued, each test revealing neurological function that medical textbooks declared impossible. Lawrence's legs responded to touch, pressure, and positional changes with reflexes that proved neural pathways were not only intact, but functioning at near-normal levels. "Dr. Henley," Lawrence said quietly during a pause in the examination, "can you feel this?" He had reached down and was gently pinching his own thigh, demonstrating sensation that should have been permanently lost. The doctor's response came with the stunned tone of someone whose fundamental understanding of medical reality was being overturned by practical demonstration. "Lawrence, complete T12 spinal cord injuries don't recover sensation. What you're claiming should be medically impossible." "Should be impossible," Lawrence agreed, "but here we are." The breakthrough moment arrived when Dr. Henley conducted a comprehensive test of Lawrence's motor function, asking him to demonstrate voluntary movement and control throughout his lower extremities. Lawrence not only flexed his feet and bent his knees on command, but stood up from the examination table and walked across the stage with coordination that required sophisticated neural communication between his brain and legs. The crowd erupted in applause that could be heard blocks away as Dr. Henley stared at test results that contradicted 18 months of medical certainty. Her handheld reflex hammer trembled as she documented responses that proved Lawrence's spinal cord was processing signals that shouldn't exist according to conventional medical understanding. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Henley announced to the crowd, her professional composure cracking as she faced evidence that challenged everything she had been taught about permanent neurological damage. "Lawrence's neurological responses are consistent with functional spinal cord connectivity, which contradicts his original diagnosis of complete injury." Detective Walsh lowered his radio and stepped back from the stage as he realized that enforcing court orders to stop Lawrence's treatment would mean halting documented medical recovery that was being proven real in front of hundreds of witnesses. Victoria began live streaming Dr. Henley's examination results, her commentary providing real-time analysis for viewers worldwide who were witnessing medical orthodoxy being overturned by a 12-year-old boy's determination to walk. "What you're seeing is not faith healing or wishful thinking," Victoria narrated as Lawrence demonstrated complex motor control that required sophisticated neural pathways. "This is documented neurological recovery from an injury that 17 specialists declared permanently disabling." The examination continued for 20 minutes, with Dr. Henley testing every aspect of Lawrence's neurological function while news cameras captured evidence that would transform understanding of spinal cord injury recovery. Each test revealed capabilities that conventional medicine insisted were impossible, documented by the same medical establishment that had originally declared his case hopeless. Mark stepped forward to provide context for Lawrence's recovery that went beyond simple medical testing. "Dr. Henley, what you're documenting isn't spontaneous healing. It's the result of 6 weeks of intensive intervention using techniques that the medical establishment rejected without trial." "What techniques?" Dr. Henley asked, her scientific curiosity finally overcoming her professional defensiveness. Lawrence answered before Mark could respond, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through every aspect of his own recovery. "Electrical stimulation to wake up sleeping neural pathways, physical manipulation to encourage signal transmission, and the belief that impossible things happen when people refuse to accept expert limitations." The 12-year-old's explanation silenced the fairgrounds as hundreds of people absorbed the implications of recovery achieved through methods so simple that medical establishment had dismissed them without investigation. Dr. Henley completed her examination with results that would require rewriting medical textbooks. "Lawrence demonstrates functional sensation, voluntary motor control, and coordinated movement throughout his lower extremities. These findings are inconsistent with complete spinal cord injury at any level." The admission represented more than medical assessment. It was institutional acknowledgement that conventional medicine had been wrong about Lawrence's prognosis, wrong about treatment possibilities, and wrong about the finality of spinal cord damage. As applause thundered across the fairgrounds, Lawrence walked to the edge of the stage where his wheelchair waited like a symbol of limitations he had overcome through determination that experts had tried to discourage. Instead of sitting down, he picked up the wheelchair and carried it, demonstrating strength and mobility that made its continued use unnecessary. "Dr. Henley," Lawrence said as he set the wheelchair aside, "thank you for finally looking at what is, instead of insisting on what should be impossible." The moment marked the complete vindication of everything the underground treatment program had risked. Lawrence's recovery was no longer disputed or hidden. It was documented, verified, and witnessed by a community that had watched medical impossibility become practical reality. Victoria realized that their secret resistance had evolved into a public movement that would transform how medicine approached recovery from devastating injuries. Lawrence's walk across the stage had become a march toward medical revolution, where innovation triumphed over orthodoxy and impossible recoveries were celebrated rather than criminalized. The breakthrough moment had arrived not in a hospital or laboratory, but on a small-town fair stage where a 12-year-old boy proved that sometimes the most important medical discoveries happened when people stopped accepting expert limitations and started believing in possibilities that authorities had declared extinct. 6 months after the community fair demonstration that had transformed Lawrence's illegal recovery into global medical revolution, the former pool house at the Ashford Smith Mansion had evolved into the Lopez Smith Institute for Neurological Recovery, a facility that drew patients and researchers from around the world. The small treatment center where Lawrence had first taken his tentative steps now bustled with the controlled energy of a place where medical impossibilities were routinely transformed into documented recoveries. Victoria stood at the Institute's entrance, watching the morning arrival of families whose children had been written off by conventional medicine but were now participating in treatment programs that the medical establishment had finally been forced to acknowledge. The brass plaque beside the door read, "Where Innovation Meets Hope, established 2024. But Victoria knew the real establishment had happened months earlier when a 12-year-old boy refused to accept expert limitations on his recovery. Lawrence walked past her with the confident stride of someone whose journey from paralysis to mobility had become a roadmap for others facing similar challenges. At 13, he possessed a maturity that came from understanding how individual determination could transform institutional thinking, but he had retained the enthusiasm of someone who still marveled at his body's capacity for healing. "Morning, Mom," Lawrence called as he headed toward the advanced rehabilitation wing where his own recovery continued alongside cutting-edge research that was rewriting medical textbooks. "Dr. Chen says my latest nerve conduction studies show improvement that shouldn't be possible even for someone who's already achieved the impossible." The transformation in Lawrence extended far beyond his recovered mobility. His experience had given him insights into human potential that made him a powerful advocate for patients whose cases had been declared hopeless by medical orthodoxy. He spent his afternoons working with newly arrived children, sharing the perspective of someone who had traveled the journey from absolute paralysis to functional recovery. Mark emerged from the main treatment facility wearing the professional attire of someone whose unconventional methods had become the foundation for an entirely new field of neurological rehabilitation. His transformation from handyman to internationally recognized innovator still amazed Victoria, though she had learned that breakthrough discoveries often came from people who approached problems without the limitations imposed by formal training. "The morning progress reports are remarkable," Mark said, reviewing the tablet that contained documentation of recoveries that would have been dismissed as impossible just months earlier. "Maria Santos is now walking independently for distances over a mile. The Johnson twins are demonstrating coordination that contradicts everything we thought we knew about autism-related motor limitations. And the new patient from Germany, complete C6 spinal injury, showed voluntary finger movement yesterday." The Institute's success had attracted attention that extended far beyond medical circles. Pharmaceutical companies that had initially tried to suppress Mark's methods were now offering partnership agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Government health agencies that had attempted to shut down Lawrence's treatment were requesting consultation on integrating innovative approaches into standard rehabilitation protocols. Victoria had declined most of the corporate offers, understanding that the Institute's mission couldn't be achieved within traditional medical infrastructure that prioritized profit over breakthrough. Instead, they had established the Lopez Smith Foundation, funded by Victoria's pharmaceutical industry connections but operating independently from corporate influence that might compromise their innovative approaches. The documentary crew from Netflix arrives this afternoon, Victoria told Mark as they reviewed the day's schedule. They want to film Lawrence's story as part of their series on medical breakthroughs that challenged institutional thinking. Lawrence's recovery had become a symbol for families worldwide who faced similar situations where medical establishment had declared cases hopeless. The Institute received hundreds of applications weekly from parents whose children had been written off by specialists, creating waiting lists that stretched months into the future. Dr. Patricia Hinley appeared in the Institute's entrance, Her transformation from skeptical authority figure to collaborative researcher, representing the broader changes that Lawrence's case had catalyzed throughout the medical community. Her presence at the Institute each week demonstrated how professional humility could triumph over institutional pride when confronted with undeniable evidence. Lawrence, Dr. Henley called out with the warm familiarity of someone who had learned to appreciate being proven wrong. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Amanda Foster from the International Spinal Cord Research Consortium. She's here to study our protocols for potential implementation in clinical trials worldwide." The conversation that followed would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier, leading neurological researchers seeking guidance from a 13-year-old boy whose recovery had challenged everything they thought they understood about permanent disability. Lawrence's insights into the recovery process had become as valuable as Mark's technical innovations, proving that patient experience could inform medical advancement in ways that laboratory research couldn't achieve alone. "Dr. Foster," Lawrence said with the confident communication skills that had developed through months of sharing his story with medical professionals, "the most important thing to understand is that recovery isn't something that happens to you. It's something you participate in actively. My legs didn't remember how to walk by themselves. I had to teach them, and they had to teach my brain, and we all had to learn together." The Institute's research wing had documented recovery patterns that were revolutionizing understanding of neurological healing. Mark's electrical stimulation protocols were now being tested in rehabilitation centers across 3 continents. His manual therapy techniques had been refined through collaboration with university research programs that were eager to understand how simple interventions could achieve results that sophisticated technology had failed to produce. Victoria found herself reflecting on the journey that had transformed their family crisis into global medical revolution. The desperate phone call to Lopez and Sons home repair that had brought Mark into their lives now seemed like destiny rather than coincidence, though she understood that destiny often disguised itself as ordinary moments when extraordinary people chose to help. The Foundation Board meeting is scheduled for Thursday, Rebecca informed Victoria as they reviewed the Institute's expansion plans. The proposal for satellite facilities in Boston, Atlanta, and Los Angeles has been approved, along with funding for the International Fellowship Program. The Lopez Smith Institute was no longer just a treatment facility. It had become a training center where medical professionals learned to approach neurological recovery with the innovation and persistence that conventional medicine had abandoned. The fellowship program attracted doctors, therapists, and researchers who wanted to understand how impossible recoveries became possible when expertise combined with determination. Lawrence joined Victoria in her office as the afternoon session concluded, his presence a daily reminder of how individual courage could transform institutional limitations. At 13, he had achieved more than mobility recovery. He had become living proof that medical impossibility was often just another word for professional surrender. "Mom," Lawrence said as he settled into the chair across from her desk, "Dr. Foster asked me something interesting today. She wanted to know if I ever regret going through all this. The legal battles, the underground treatment, the public demonstration, instead of just accepting my paralysis and adapting to wheelchair life." Victoria looked at her son, this remarkable young man whose refusal to accept expert limitations had transformed not just his own future but the prospects for countless families facing similar challenges. "What did you tell her?" Lawrence's response carried the wisdom of someone who had learned that individual determination could overcome institutional authority when guided by people willing to risk everything for breakthrough possibilities. "I told her that adaptation is what you do when recovery isn't possible. But recovery is what you do when people refuse to accept that adaptation is the only option." The Institute's evening lights illuminated treatment areas where children who had arrived in wheelchairs were taking their first independent steps, where families who had been told to accept permanent limitations were discovering that permanence was sometimes just another word for giving up too early. Outside, Mark's pickup truck still sat in the parking area, no longer the vehicle of a traveling handyman, but a symbol of how breakthrough healing often arrived in the most unexpected forms, driven by people whose determination exceeded their credentials and whose willingness to challenge authority surpassed their fear of failure. As Lawrence walked home through the neighborhood where his recovery had begun, his confident stride represented more than personal triumph. It embodied the transformation of medical understanding, family resilience, and community support that had proven impossible recoveries were possible when people chose hope over resignation, innovation over orthodoxy, and faith in human potential over acceptance of expert limitations. The boy who had been told he would never walk again was now helping others discover that walking was just the beginning of what became possible when medical impossibility met human determination guided by people brave enough to try. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.